Dirk Kotze is on Skype for some insights into this developing saga. Very good evening to you, Mr. Kotze. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the Globe.
Thank you.
Well, so much has been said about former President de Klerk's apology, and well, he's since withdrawn that statement that he issued on the 14th of February. You reckon the apology is enough?
Well, I think he's in a very difficult situation because I guess no apology at this stage will really rectify the situation of what was said earlier this month. The fact that he made that statement then was really if we look at it from a very unfortunate point of view, because it was the celebration of the 2nd of February when he was one of the main figures of that event and the unbanning of the ANC and later the release of President Mandela. So for him to say it at that point, I think was, from all perspectives, it was something which really sort of confused the population. Because on the one hand, he took that 30 years ago, that very positive step for all of us. But then at the same time, he made a statement which, in a sense, starts to ask for us to ask the question, but what was then the real intent of it? He apologized at the time of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The chairperson then, Archbishop Tutu, was critical of his apology. Thereafter, he did it again. But I think for some other reason, it has never come through as a genuine apology. And I think this is why this incident or this event was, in a sense, sort of fire on the oil that really stoked it again.
Well, this is not the first time that de Klerk has apologized. He's apologized countless times before for apartheid and the kind of impact that it had on black South Africans. And then oftentimes his apology was not accepted because ostensibly because it does not address the fundamental issue that apartheid brings on South Africans, particularly black South Africans, and he did not acknowledge that apartheid was an evil policy and regime. So do you think there is some genuineness in this kind of apology?
Well, I think if you just look at the text of this latest statement, it goes as far as I've never heard it before. Either the FW de Klerk Foundation or Mr. de Klerk himself has gone. And the fact that they referred specifically to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, which is actually the first real document that formalizes the definition of what crimes against humanity is. And they, in their words, fully embrace that. I think that is as far as you can go about the notion of crimes against humanity. But I think one should not confine it only to a legal definition. And I think this is possibly the complication now. It becomes now whether it is crimes against humanity for him or not, or whether it is genocide or not. And I think in the end, that is not the real point. It is for him to say, and he has said it in the past, that apartheid was wrong. And it was morally unacceptable, because I think what is also very important is that this statement has a very important impact on the credibility and legitimacy of the negotiations process. And it also will affect persons like Ruth Meyer and Leon Wessels and Kobie Kotze and others who were fully involved in the negotiation process. And if there's some question marks are raised now about whether they were fully behind it or what was their motivation for the negotiations, then it can have a very negative impact in the long term for the legacy of negotiations in South Africa.
You know, Professor, apartheid bears the hallmarks of genocide. It bears the hallmarks of the Holocaust. And countries such as Austria and Germany, where it is a crime to deny Holocaust, should it be a crime to deny apartheid in South Africa or even racism?
Well, obviously, it's not a crime in terms of our legislation. Our legislation is mainly sort of linked to the equality courts when it comes to these things about whether it's hate speech or whether it is racist in nature or a negative reflection on person's human dignity. So at this stage, I think it's still very much a grey area, but it's certainly not at this stage. And as far as I understand it, and I'm not a lawyer, that it is actually a crime. It is rather at this stage more of a moral issue, and therefore I look at it very much from a moral perspective. statement of the FW de Klerk Foundation and Mr. de Klerk, and not so much purely from a legal point of view.
Yeah, more so because there's been debate with regards to whether denying it should be a crime or not, because, ostensibly it becomes an infringement on freedom of speech and expression, because committing a crime is criminal itself, but then commenting or commentary on that particular crime shouldn't be.
Yes, that is what I mean. It becomes such a complicated legal matter that, and it actually loses the essence of the issue. And the essence of the issue is about what was in the past the very nature of apartheid. And it was not only a legal issue, it was much more than that. It was a moral issue, it was an issue about human dignity, it was an issue about human rights. And I think we should restore it to that position, that is in the end the debate. And then whether you talk about reconciliation or social cohesion or a form of national integration or nation building, then all of these other matters can follow. But if it's made purely a legal issue, then it becomes a debate within the courts, and I don't think that is where the debate should be.
And there's been acts of racism lately, and some people even suggesting that racism hasn't completely gone away in South Africa. You reckon that is the case? Do you think that racism is now rearing its ugly head again?
Well, racism has never disappeared in South Africa. We all know that. We've heard about incidents very often, or something that happened, and that persons in some cases have been accused of murder and other aspects related to that. So we all know that is very much still an issue. But I think, again, something which President Mbeki very much referred to at the end of his term as president was the idea of a national dialogue. And he and others were arguing that we haven't had really, we had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And it served its purpose at the very early stage of President Mandela's and the government of national unity. But it sort of stopped abruptly, and there hasn't been really a follow-up. And what I think what is very much necessary is that a much more widespread dialogue should over time develop in South Africa about these issues, because I think in countries that now experience racism in a very ugly way, like for example in the US or some of the European countries, they've never had that type of dialogue.
What do you make then of calls that he should be stripped of his Nobel Peace Prize?
Well, that's not our decision. That was granted to him by an international committee. South Africans have no say over that. And it's for them to decide whether they want to recall it or not.
What needs to happen then to heal South Africa of the racial divide and the racial polarizations?
Well, that's the $1 million or the R1 million or the R1 billion question. It's not something which I can give you now immediately a very quick fix answer for that. It's something that affects not only politics or human rights, it affects the economic relations in South Africa, it affects the spatial development of South Africa and where people live in relation to each other. It affects all sorts of aspects. And I think that is why, in the end, I don't think it really can be forced onto people. In the end, it will have to become something in which there's a buy into it. Everyone is seeing it is in their interest, and it ultimately is in the interest of South Africa. So it sounds very idealistic, it sounds very non-specific, but the moment you start to overmanage it, then it becomes artificial, and then it is not really something with a long-term future.
All right, Dr. Kotze, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your insights. That is University of South Africa's Professor Dirk Kotze joining us via Skype.